words of Mae West, anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. So on that note, I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight's event, which is about travel and slow travel. Now, travel is obviously something we all have a stake in. It's something we all do. We've traveled here this evening for this event. Most of us, all of us, I thought. We travel to work, we travel to school, we travel to leisure activities, we travel to play, we take business trips, we travel on holiday, and of course we travel in the mind as well. But travel, like everything else in our culture, has, in the last century or so, accelerated. It's got faster and faster and faster. For most of human history, you could only cross a landmass at the speed that your feet could carry you or a horse could carry you. You enter the modern era, and we've got steam engines, and then cars, and then now planes. And of course the next step is to fire people up into lower orbit at unimaginable speeds. But I suppose the question before us tonight is, what does all this acceleration mean for travel, for the business of travel, for the art of travel? Is this fast-forward culture ready for something called slow travel? I wonder, do you think that the way we are now, in this turbocharged, media-drenched, adrenaline-rich culture that we live in, that we almost need to be forced to travel slowly? Or do you think there's a kind of natural human need? How do you see that? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think it's something that Ed and I have both thought about, and I do think at the moment there's a sort of compulsion to be busy and to travel fast. I mean, that's definitely the sort of default mode of the world that we live in. I think there's no doubt about that. You've written about that, and I think it's also sort of connected with status, which I think is something that doesn't get perhaps talked about enough.
It feels almost mindlessly simple to go on and book a flight on EasyJet.
Business travel, and I do a certain amount of that, and trips that are organised for the press, and it's often in Europe, and it's very, very difficult. I find when I say, could we go by train perhaps to this place in France, which would be very easy to get to by train, and they're absolutely horrified. And it's almost like I say, could I bring a live cobra? Basically a coil. I mean, yes, it's possible, but the time, you can't do it. It's awful. And they just don't like it. So there's a horror of that sort of extra expenditure of time, which is quite irrational, I think. I think we have to mention the very, the basic and boring and annoying fact that it's just more expensive on the whole to travel by train, which is, I think is crazy. But to me, that's really a matter for governments. I really do feel very strongly that you can't really expect ordinary people to pay 5 times as much to travel by train as they can by air. It's just not going to happen. So I think there has to be some government action on that.
And I think there is a question about maybe scaling back the way that we travel and changing the mode of travel could increase the pleasure factor of it a lot more. I've talked about it a lot in the writing about that kind of experiencing the transition of landscape, culture, people and language, and having that more sort of languid type of travel experience, which, whilst it takes a lot longer, is very, very different to the sort of wham bam, thank you ma'am of a short haul flight.
The most profound thing ever written about travel was written 2,000 years ago by the Roman poet Horace, and it's quite reassuring in a way, this poem, and I won't read all, it's very short, but I won't even read all of it, but one thing that's reassuring is the thought that actually some of the questions we're facing now are not entirely new, and the Romans were very sophisticated people, and there was a kind of travel bug, sort of wanderlust at that time as well. And in this little letter, it's Epistle 11, the first book of Epistles, Horace is writing to a friend of his called Boulatius, and it begins, what did you think of Chios, that's the Greek island of Chios, Boulatius, and of famous Lesbos, another Greek island. What of charming Samos, another Greek island. So they used to go up to Greek islands in those days too, even before EasyJet, can you believe it? And what of Smyrna and Colophon, and so on. And this is a guy, obviously, he's writing to a guy who loves travelling. But Horace himself, it turns out, is actually coming from a very different position. And then he says, Well, perhaps maybe you're singing the praises of a place called Lebedos. Lebedos is actually an incredibly desolate town. But Horace says, yes, but I would love to live there, and forgetting my friends, and forgotten by my friends, gaze upon the furious ocean from the land. So he's saying, actually, what appeals to him is to go to a godforsaken seaside town and just stare at the ocean. And at the end of this poem, which is actually quite famous, this is a passage which is really the most profound about it. And he says, those who run across the seas change the sky or the climate, not their mind. And just that one line, I think, is one of the most profound things written about travel. And then he says, a busy idleness consumes us. We try to live well in yachts and fast cars. Actually, chariots and Rome. Same thing, really. But what you seek is here. It's in this town of Ulubrai, which is another godforsaken place. It's here in Ulubrai if a well-balanced mind stays with you. So what he's really saying is you don't need to travel at all. And all this travelling is actually really rather unnecessary. So that's taking it a stage further.
Can you get those same needs and desires met, perhaps in a much more localised form of travel? You don't need to say twang yourself overseas necessarily, because the journey is actually within.
Yes, presumably when the idea of travel is that you're travelling to something, but you're also travelling away from something. Is it not also the case that as we look abroad and see travel overseas as an escape hatch, that we end up denigrating what we actually have at home? And I'm not talking necessarily about the laundry-strewn flat, but actually what we have here in London or around us in England and Scotland. So.
Yeah, well, I think that notion of escapism does sort of reflect an element of neglect about the immediate stuff we have here. And I always used to think it was slightly ironic, when, okay, we were in New Zealand, but when we'd meet British backpackers in New Zealand, sort of marvelling at the alpine and mountain landscapes, who had never been to Scotland, Wales or Ireland, and you're saying, well, actually it's quite similar to here, but you've had to go halfway around the planet.
Perhaps don't travel quite as much as, I actually don't know what the statistics are, but I shouldn't think they do. And when I lived in Spain, I was very struck by the tremendous pride Spanish people tend to have in their own neck of the woods. They call it patria chica in Spanish. And people are tremendously proud of their pueblo and their area. And unfortunately, often in England, Yorkshiremen are probably very often proud, quite rightly so. But I think it is quite sad that southern England has been turned into a slightly kind of sort of partly homogenous and partly sort of faceless place. And I think this is what point you were making earlier, that something that isn't very often brought up, that by constantly getting away from places, we are actually in danger of neglecting and even damaging those places. And